We made it as difficult and as cumbersome to build a 6-story building as a 60-story building with all the studies and fees. And so people just built the 60-story building. And I think that's where there's such a disconnect.
We are lucky enough today to have Councillor Brad Bradford joining us.
50,000 people left the City of Toronto last year. Those are the builders. Those are the families. Those are the entrepreneurs. Those are the people who want to take a risk and make a bet.
How do we actually make a change, and what is it that is going to actually move the needle to make this change?
There's a disconnect between the financial realities and the pro forma of our policy, of the policymakers who are holding the pen. And they came up with these things that might score high marks at a planning conference. They might be great in a TED Talk, but in terms of the financial realities or even the constructability of these projects, it didn't pencil. We have now effectively killed the condo market. Well, I'm bullish as hell on Toronto, but it does feel less safe. It certainly is harder to get around, and it's never been more expensive than it is right now.
What is going on, guys? We are back with another episode of the Build Financial podcast, and we are lucky enough today to have our good friend, Councillor Brad Bradford, joining us today. For anybody who is being in the multifamily space, who has gone to any event in Toronto, has basically watched the news or seen anything, you probably know who Brad is. Brad is a champion for missing middle housing, for mid-infill development, is really pushing the needle on moving development forward in the city. We are very excited to have you. Thanks for coming on.
Thanks for having me on the pod. This is great.
Yeah, I know. It's always good to connect with like-minded people, especially people who have policy in mind and who can actually make a difference. So, we're really excited to have this conversation. I think a lot of our viewers are going to be excited to listen to it as well.
Let's do it.
Why don't you tell us a little bit about how you got here? What do you do? What are you passionate about? How'd you get to where you're at now?
Well, I got here by battling 45 minutes of traffic. It always feels like you're an hour away from Toronto when you're in Toronto. But I was coming up from City Hall. My background and my training is in urban planning. So I've always been fascinated with cities. That was my vocation. That's what I studied. I started off working in the private sector at a firm called Dialogue here in Toronto. I was working on mainly transit projects, interestingly. Most of them weren't here in Ontario. I was doing work out in Alberta. And what was cool about the private sector was just the variety of work, the different things, the different cities that you got to see. I moved down to Boston, Massachusetts for 3 years after that, living in a neighborhood called JP, Jamaica Plain. Growing up, you always sort of think you'd never have an opportunity to live or work in the U.S. because you'd have to prove that 300 million Americans couldn't do that job. Of course, that's not the case. There's something at the time called temporary NAFTA visa. Urban planner was one of the professions. So I went down there, and then back in 2015, I came back to Toronto, and I landed a job in the chief planner's office at the City of Toronto. So that was my first experience and exposure to sort of big bureaucracy and local government and being on the municipal side of things and politics. And I did that for 3 years, and I saw, some of the really great things that government can do, what it's set up well to be successful with. And then, of course, I saw the friction, I saw the frustration, I saw the roadblocks, I saw the bureaucracy. I saw the culture of no, the inability to make a decision, all of these things that probably a lot of the listeners find frustrating when dealing with government. And, on the political side of it, I was involved in an organization called Civic Action, which was a mentorship program for young leaders. And all of my fellows in the fellowship program, they were doing really incredible things. Somebody had, made an app to connect seniors with services. Somebody had started a food bank. And I would show up each month and complain about being middle management with no direct reports, of course, very bureaucratic, and just sort of voicing that frustration. So eventually people said, stop complaining about it, put your hand up, run for office, try and make it better. So I had never been political. I'd never been a member of a party. That's still true today. I was raised by a single mom down in Hamilton who had 3 kids, so we were never involved in politics, never had a sign on the lawn or anything like that, but we had dinner table conversations about government, about politics, about what mattered. So, like a lot of people, you talk about it, you think about it, maybe you complain about it, but I didn't have the apparatus or background. I knew a couple political people. One guy I played hockey with, interestingly, in Cambridge, down your way, and he had been working on a counselor's office and sort of said, "Hey, Colin, thinking about running for office." He's like, "Well, save your time, save your money, save your marriage. Don't do it. It's a terrible idea." So that wasn't particularly inspiring. Talked to another person, basically had the same version, but I think it was honestly like my lack of experience with it, or even my naivety about it. I just said, I'm going to work hard and go out and knock doors. Because I worked at the city, I had to take a 6-month unpaid leave of absence. I knocked 50,000 doors that summer. And at the end of the day, on election night, it was like 37,000 votes cast, and I won by 286 votes. So, it was a pretty emotional night. And then after that, like, you're in the game, and it's kind of unlike the bureaucracy where everything is just so process heavy. There's no playbook on the elected official side. They give you like a Medco key to open up the office, and there's like 4 old computers in there, and it's sort of like, go have at it. So I've just been trying to figure it out, the 7 years since, and we'll get into some of the stuff at City Hall, but I can't think of a better job and a better role where you can make more of an impact about the things that probably all of us really care about.
I think at this time in Canada as well too, I mean, obviously there's a lot of things people probably have, opinions on, but obviously, we're focused on the housing. But, with you coming back or coming with the background of, urban planning and seeing the need for affordable homes, affordable developments on the rental side, yeah, I think it's, stars kind of align and put you in a position where you have a very big possibility to make some really great changes. And I think, to take a look at what's going on in the real estate world right now, especially on like this whole mid-size, private sector size, like there's a lot of people that are looking for someone like you to to be able to step up and kind of take charge and really make some changes, because there's a lot of potential out there and guys that are really good at what they do, and they can make a lot of changes.
Well, and the politics of housing are changing. Like, it was not that long ago, ironically, when I ran in 2018, I was running against an NDP former member of parliament. So he had all the name rec, he had all the resources, the lists, all the stuff that makes it a little bit easier. But the, quote, progressive candidate, was running on status quo. The progressive candidate was running on neighborhood character. It's not lost on me that I represent a riding called Beaches East York. We've got $1 billion subway line, line 2, going right through the middle of it. And you look around and everything on top of it is 2-story development. And so one of the misconceptions might be for a lot of folks is they think of the progressives, the left-leaning councillors, as the champions for affordability, the champions for housing. And yet you look at the track record when they've been in power. A lot of the time, the type of growth has been anemic. The projects have been burdened with significant delays, cost overruns, and then they do, some slip in these poison pills, is what I call them, where it's something that looks good on paper or as a motion, make this development 50% affordable. But for guys that understand finance or how to drive a pro forma, that effectively kills the project. Mm-hmm. So rather than the sort of blatant NIMBYism of like, oh, that building's too tall, it's more veiled and more subtle, where it's death by 1,000 cuts. And they will say, well, this project has to, achieve a higher level of TGS. It has to be 50% affordable. We have to have, these particular trades working on it. It also has to be a jobs program. It also has to, uplift and enhance transit infrastructure in the area. And then all of a sudden it's like, well, math doesn't math on this. This project doesn't pencil, and it's dead on arrival. So all that is to say, I think since 2018 when I was elected, there was a time when politicians would literally campaign on taking an 18-story building and knocking it down to 12, and they'd be a hero. And they go out to the community and say, look, I knocked off, 6 stories of housing there. We made the building smaller. I'm standing up for the community. I don't know if it's as easy or as politically expedient to do that today. And I think that's a good thing, because when that 18-story building comes down to 12, inevitably it's more expensive to construct. Those costs are passed on to the consumer, makes the housing more expensive, and of course, it's less supply at a time when we desperately need it.
Well, I think we are entering almost like a Goldilocks zone, or all the stars are aligning. I think for a long time, you didn't necessarily need the economics to work. Rent wasn't nearly as high as it once was. The cost of building wasn't nearly as high. The cost of debt was pretty cheap for a long time, and people got away with building condos. But where we're going now, it's out of necessity. I think people are sick of the dog rate condos. They're looking for something fresh. They're looking for, from an investor side, they're looking for something that still makes sense without having to spend an incredible amount of money. And I think the stars are aligning from the federal government, where they're coming down and they're forcing increased densification on larger municipalities and larger cities now. And now municipally, due to funding, you guys have to push that rhetoric through and get it done. And I think it's a headwind for new type of development that's coming to Toronto that's going to be honestly better than these skyscrapers. But you have to push past that NIMBYism to show them like how beautiful the architecture can be, or how great these things can be for these like smaller pockets of the city.
You think about great cities in the North American context, or even internationally. You think about neighborhoods, New York, Jane Jacobs, Greenwich Village, Tribeca, parts of Brooklyn. You think about the fantastic brownstones that exist in Boston or in Montreal. You think some of the most fantastic neighborhoods in Toronto. You think about the Annex. You think about parts of Etobicoke. You think about even the beaches. Missing Middle multiplex has existed for 100 years. It has been there. It is core to the fabric of these really fantastic places to raise a family, build a business, that vibrancy on the street, and the variety of supply that you can integrate into those neighborhoods. And yet, post-amalgamation here in the city of Toronto, the grand bargain that was struck at the time in the official plan was really like, okay, we're going to consolidate all these boroughs. We're going to be one big happy city. It's going to be the mega city. And here's how we're going to do planning. We are going to direct all the growth to the avenues, to the centers, and the neighborhoods are going to be status quo. They're going to be static. And this was the whole conversation that was kind of top of mind a few years ago around the Yellow Belt, before we had allowed multiplex across the city. And, you look at what ended up happening. We got a bunch of really tall towers, 60-story buildings, et cetera. And there's nothing wrong with that. We should be building high density where we have transit infrastructure in the centers. But the avenues and mid-rise never materialized. And that's because we made it as difficult and as cumbersome to build a 6-story building as a 60-story building, with all the studies and fees. And so people just built the 60-story building. And I think that's where, certainly as a former bureaucrat, civil servant, urban planner at the city, and where I am now on the political side, there's such a disconnect. There's a disconnect between the financial realities and the pro forma of our policy, of the policymakers who are holding the pen. And they came up with these things that, might score high marks at a planning conference. They might be great in a TED Talk, but in terms of the financial realities or even the constructability of these projects, it didn't pencil. And so in a city that claimed to be a mid-rise city, at a city that's had more development and investment than anywhere else on the continent over the past 20 years, only a fraction of that has been mid-rise. And we've just seen the same type of development, rinse and repeat in the centers over and over. And then subsequently, I think changes made in the federal government with respect to some of the policies, foreign buyers, with respect to vacant home tax here in the city of Toronto and other things, we have now effectively killed the condo market, which of course served as a pseudo-rental market ever since they got rid of some of the more favorable tax policies and the MURBs back in the 80s and 90s. Condo market was the rental market, but now that's been killed. And so in the death of that, which I think warrants a longer and broader conversation, we're opening up new opportunities. And that is where the missing middle comes to the front. And I think one of the cool things about that is it is also at a size and a scale where real estate and home building and development becomes more accessible to different type of consumers, but also more accessible to a new era or class of builders. and people who want to make that bet, but because the capital costs are not, so enormous to be able to do it, people can pool their money together and land a really cool project, hopefully something that, they can break even on, perhaps generate passive income into the future, but also provide the type of housing in the type of neighborhoods that we all want to see.
Yeah, I mean, like, I was in Montreal just a couple of months ago, and I hadn't been there since I was like a kid playing hockey and stuff. But I didn't realize until you get into space. I mean, first off, I didn't realize how many apartment buildings are everywhere until I got into like mortgages, and you start seeing it. But like, you go to Montreal and you realize like how much multifamily there is, and a lot of it's older. And I understand the idea and the concept of not wanting to take away some character from certain neighborhoods, and I get that. But I think that's where the missing middle housing like really has its like a strong foothold, is that you can get the density in there, but still have these buildings that fit the characteristics of that neighborhood. It doesn't have to be, steel beams and glass windows. Like, you can have these great looking buildings, walk up style, red brick, brown brick style buildings, and still fit into the neighborhood. And I think that's why like the missing middle, like one of the most important things about it is that it kind of is that missing link. It allows you to bridge the gap on the density and still have, the NIMBYism is still going to be there, but I think it's easier for people to accept these mid-sized buildings than it is to just be, erecting skyscraper type condo buildings. The people that are looking to build these missing middle projects are like beyond innovative. I mean, they're looking at building out like little mini communities. How can we work with transportation? How do we get the community feel there and bringing everyone together? Not just, I want to put a building up and make money at the end of the day, and that's all I'm there for. Like, the individuals and the private sector developers that are really pushing these projects, that's not their mindset. Like, they truly do care. They're really looking at making things better for the city. They're younger individuals, early 40s to early 30s. So they're going to have a family growing up. It's neighborhoods they're going to be growing up in. It's a very unique approach, not to take away and to put any like negative shade on the more like commercial higher end developers, but it's a different approach, and I really like where it's heading. I think it's a great section.
Yeah, and I think that it's interesting because you got to follow the capital. You were alluding to there are policymakers, and then there are gaps in why certain things don't happen, and a lot of the times it's because the debt servicing doesn't work. The debt isn't there to be able to build the things that we want. It's a great idea. We'd love for it to work, but again, if the economics behind it don't work, they don't work. You're not going to have any development.
And I would add on that also that the tendency for politicians and maybe other public figures to sort of villainize the people that build the housing, the thing that we say we desperately need, the home builders, the developers, they're often villainized as like, this big greedy developer or builder or whatever. And, what people lose sight of is, it's the banks that are actually deciding whether or not they're going to finance a project. And guess what? Like, the banks aren't really in the business of losing money, and they're not going to be financing projects that are losing money before they start. And so, like, we want projects to be viable. We recognize that 20% of the Ontario economy is related to home construction, to buildings and trades. And the big risk right now, in my view, is the fact that new home starts more broadly here in Toronto have cratered. And we have a surplus of units in the market right now, and I understand that, and they will be absorbed over the next 12 to 18 months. Like, I get that. But projects that are not starting today are not going to be able to be occupied in 2027, 2028. So in the irony of, these conversations about housing crisis and, what can we do to build more homes, you have to look at the cost of these projects and make sure that the cost is financially viable, because nothing starting today is only going to exacerbate the crisis in 2 to 3 years from now, because you can't move into the home that wasn't built today and won't exist then.
Yeah, it's kind of a function of capital flow, and unfortunately, capital is not flowing. But what we're seeing is, there was a ton of capital moving, back when residential real estate was moving, right? But that money needs to find a scalable way to be able to deploy. And what's happening is people are getting into or they're pooling capital to get into this space. And as Ehren was saying, like, the products that we have now available need to align with the zoning and the densification laws that you guys are passing. Because, for example, in Kitchener, you can't have 5 units on a single lot. And then, you have policymakers asking, well, why aren't we having any of this development housing or infill housing here? It's because you need 5 units to be able to get CMHC construction debt or to get CMHC commercial debt. So I think there's just like a gap here between understanding how the debt and capital is flowing, because the retail investors can no longer afford regular rental housing. It just, their income no longer supports the debt it takes to do it. So, they're transitioning into this type of housing and building it. There just needs to be a clear line of communication as to the requirements needed to flow capital towards doing it. And then you're going to see that exasperate.
Well, that and the policy decisions too. I mean, you look at previous CMHC and their just their policy on like collateralizing mortgages. Like you could previously build like 2 fourplexes and collateralize it with a CMHC loan, but then they've gone and made that policy change where that might have been a potential option. Now you can't do that. So now it's it's understanding how the performers work and how the profit needs to be there, but also like what policies are we putting into effect that are actually going to help push this along in a positive manner as well too, not make things more difficult.
Yeah, and I think that's the guiding mantra that all governments at all levels should be trying to operate from is, look, there are challenges in front of us right now. Some of them are out of our control, financing rates, cost of labor, cost of materials, fine. But a bunch of that is in our control. So we should all be laser focused on removing the frustration, on removing the friction, on making it easier for people to do the things that we say we want them to do, which is, of course, build housing. And I think in government in general, we try and make projects accomplish everything rather than just it's a housing project. As I was saying, it's got to be a jobs program. It's got to be a community benefits. It's got to lift up and leverage transit expansion. We got to have some parks associated with this. We have to have community amenity space. And it's like all those things are great. They're all nice to have. But let's take a look at the world, with great sobriety of where we are right now. And you can't make policy in this Pollyanna universe that doesn't exist. And so you need to respond to the context and the challenges today. And we can get into some of the taxes and fees that now constitute 30% of the cost of a unit of development here in Toronto. If we want to have a conversation about making housing more affordable, maybe we start with that, because no one makes more money on housing than government. And if we really wanted to move the dial on affordability, there's a lot more that we could do there. But let's, if you're uncomfortable with talking about DC waivers or deferrals or reductions, let's sunset that. Let's do it for the next 2 years. Let's put a time frame on that and say, like, if you're pulling your permits and you're starting construction right now, you're not going to pay that, or it's going to be deferred. Something that we can do to improve the financing, improve the cash flow, and get those projects off of paper and get the shovels in the ground. But there's such a reluctance to do that.
What is the reluctance, though? What is
I think it's the mindset.
Or is it the government balance sheet? Is it the revenue that is generated that just can't be made up from another source, and that's the reason why they're not doing it?
I think some of it's ideology. You look at Mayor Chow in Toronto, for example. There is a real reticence to work with market builders. There's a real reticence to engaging with the private sector. And in fact, we've taken nearly $500 million from the federal government housing accelerator funds, and rather than using that to reduce the cost of the housing that people in the market, some of the best in the world, are trying to build, we've decided, let's go buy some green patch boots, put on a hard hat, and start swinging a hammer. Let's be the public builder. Let's build housing ourselves. And my goodness, if this yields a single unit of affordable housing, it will be the most expensive affordable housing in the country's history, because anytime the government is touching it, it is going to take 3 times as long and cost 3 times as much. If you wanted to secure a bunch of affordable units, you'd probably be better off by just going out and buying existing housing stock that is sitting there, picking it up on a discount, and, putting units together that way.
Well, absolutely. You could buy the building, put a mortgage from the government with that 500 million on it, and then just subsidize the rents. Like, there's no
Well, how
point in
many
trying to build
government-owned
it.
Right.
buildings right now are sitting semi-vacant that they could reposition into affordable
Right.
multifamilies?
And yet we want to build more bureaucracy to build more housing. So people sometimes say like, oh, geez, Brad, like you get too frustrated, you get too worked up about this stuff. I'm like, well, I'm down there every day and I see it in a way that, a lot of the public doesn't. But the direction that we are headed, the ideological pursuit, this idea that, because the mayor campaigned on a public builder, like somehow that gives validity to this idea. We will look back on this if it goes forward with a lot of regret, because last time I checked, there's no shortage of qualified developers in the city of Toronto. We should be working with those experts and new entrants into the market to get the shovels in the ground there and deliver the supply, because ultimately, supply is what is going to help ease the burden on housing prices. It is all about creating housing options that people can afford. And that is a supply side solution. There's affordable housing, which is subsidized housing, which is social housing. That's always just a conversation of how many hundreds of thousands of dollars of subsidy from which level of government is going to be applied on a per door basis. And so that's just money, like throw the money at the doors. But for, a bigger section, the middle class component of people who live in the city or would like to live in the city, that's supply side solutions. That's housing we can afford, and that's different.
But I mean, you're looking at the average detached house in Toronto costing $1 million. How does anybody even tackle that? What's an affordable home for an average family in Toronto?
There's the historic sort of markers of 80% AMR. This is, but I think the bigger thing is more housing supply in different neighborhoods, different types of housing. This is where we go in the missing middle.
Yeah.
Like that creates new family-oriented options in great neighborhoods, close to great amenities, park space, rec centers, stuff that, because of our zoning for the past 20 years have been off limits. And now some of the work I was doing when I was chair of planning and housing, we've opened that up. And there's a lot more work to do. But rental units or affordable home ownership that people can afford, shared ownership models, and we need to have the banks get their head around that from a financing and mortgage perspective. Yeah. But all of those are now possible if we set the table from a zoning site plan perspective to be less super prescriptive, but more flexible, more accommodating, and see what we can go out and build. And so I think that's the solution for people who want to have a go in Toronto. The biggest risk, as I see it, is we become a city that is increasingly less affordable. It is increasingly polarized between the concentration of poverty and the concentration of global wealth. And you see it in the data. I think it was Board of Trade came out and had numbers that 50,000 people left the city of Toronto last year. Now, we still had an increase of 200,000 people that are coming in. But those 50,000 people, those are the builders. Those are the families. Those are the entrepreneurs. Those are the people who want to take a risk and make a bet. They make $90,000 a year. They make too much money to qualify for any sorts of programs, but not enough money to be able to afford to live here. And those risk takers, those families, those people who are making a bet, when those 50,000 people leave in a flight for affordability or safety into the GTA, interprovincial migration, north-south across the border, that says a lot about the future of the city, because those are the folks who have built Toronto. Those are the folks who have historically taken those risks, made a bet, built businesses, created wealth, pay their taxes, generate paychecks, increase prosperity. And if those people can't find a way to make it here anymore, and on the other side, we're just having a concentration of, refugees, asylum seekers, different people who are coming to Toronto because of the services that are here,
Sure.
You can only sustain so much. And so that's why I think this housing challenge is so acute, because it's actually about a fight for the future of the city and who is going to be able to be here. And we want that talent. We want those risk takers. We want those families to continue to be able to call Toronto home, because if you can't, the future looks much less bright for the city.
Well, that quality of life needs to be there, so we need to work on ways to be able to increase that quality of life. Absolutely. I wasn't aware 50,000 people
Yeah.
left.
Yeah, I went to Alberta.
Yeah, well, and like Alberta's taking out ads on our subway
Yeah,
system,
yeah.
right? You know, I was out there this summer for the Stampede, and you know, you can see the appeal. You start looking at real
100%,
estate
yeah.
you look at job opportunities, what they've done with the Bow River there, the public realm, quality of life. Certainly, they don't understand traffic congestion the way we do here in Toronto. So I can see the appeal of that. Like I get it. You know, I'm bullish as hell on Toronto, but it does feel less safe. It certainly is harder to get around, and it's never been more expensive than it is right now.
Well, there's no point in running from the challenges that we have. We got to find a way to be able to fix them and face them head on. And I think that what you guys are doing in the city, the steps to date, at least from the real impact from our clients that we deal with on a day-to-day basis, adding 5 units as of right, adding the 6th units, you know, increasing the densification, cutting the red tape. You know, if you guys cut DC fees, like the amount of capital that is there that wants to deploy money for projects that work, there's no limit to it. Like they're looking for a way to be able to make it pencil. And obviously economic factors are going to be, lower rates are going to end up causing a little bit of that. But the more we can do around, you know, allowing mid-sized investors to, you know, get a shovel in the ground quickly and not have insane amounts of cost to be able to actually put this housing up, that's going to be the fastest way to do it.
Yeah, and you know, there's things that we can do: building codes, single staircases, smaller elevators. There are different things that we can do to also improve viability of these projects. There's lots of other jurisdictions that have figured out how to build these. I've done a lot of work on the Toronto vernacular, the wedding cake motif that was really the hallmark of a Toronto thing. On our avenues to recognize like it is the most inefficient, most expensive way to build a building. And I go back to our anemic mid-rise numbers in the context of all the other type of development we had. And it's like, wow, like that's a really expensive way to structure a building. It's a really expensive floor plate. All of that stuff gets passed on to the consumer. So are we able to use high quality materials and an emphasis on design, but you know, still have a basic box that can go up and be easier to construct, especially in an infill context? And the answer is yes. And, you know, again, in my transformation, or as I, you know, had a different perspective leaving the bureaucracy, all of this stuff is so subjective. Like, who said that you needed an angular plane? Was that picked up at a planning conference in Melbourne and then it just became doctrine? Like, some of these folks are so dogmatic in their views about this stuff. Oh, well, we can't have buildings casting shadows.
Why?
Okay, like there's a lot of cities, first of all, that do, and all the precedent photos and planning presentations and stuff, they're all from Europe, these tiny narrow streets where the buildings go straight up and everybody says they love it and they want a vacation there, but not in Toronto.
Yeah.
And when it's 35 degrees out in the summer, you know, where are people hanging out? They're hanging out in the shade.
Yeah.
Like it's just like this binary view of what's acceptable and what's not, absent any sort of conversation about context, is nuts, right? And so we have to break that mold. We have to challenge the dogmatic views that have been, you know, not guidelines, but in fact enforced as law for the past 20 years, and recognize that the way we build today is going to be different than the way we did it before. And by the way, like, that's not a bad thing. Change is very difficult to manage, but that's where leadership comes into place. And leadership really is about managing change. So how do we collectively have a conversation as a city, as neighborhoods, as industry to come together with clarity around what the issue is, housing, and, you know, have a discussion that's not just information sharing, but a real discussion about how we're going to fix it together.
Well, I think that's what, like, you know, a lot of our clients are looking for. I think that's what a lot of, you know, developers be looking for, is how do we actually make a change and get this to someone who can actually make the change? Like, how do we, is it supporting you and your voice? Is it, you know, being louder at City Hall? Is it, you know, what is it that is going to actually move the needle to make this change?
You know, I've never won an argument by telling somebody how stupid their position is.
Of course.
So I think there's a tendency, when you look at places like Twitter or wherever these social media conversations are happening right now, to go out and dunk on people. I don't think that's super productive. You know, some of the guys that write op-eds in the paper, in the architectural space, going out and, you know, dumping all over city staff. I don't think that's helpful either. And similarly, you know, going out and ostracizing folks from the community who are resistant to change, I don't think that helps build coalitions of support either. But dialogue from an industry perspective, dialogue from a neighborhood perspective, you know, engaging with elected officials, that's the best way to start to move people on any issue, but certainly on the housing front. Because as I moved out of planning and into politics, there was a lot of similarities in the fact that when I was an urban planner, people might not understand the profession. They might not be able to read a zoning bylaw or a site plan, but they could talk to you about the issues associated with their terrible commute. They could talk to you about why they want to live in a neighborhood serviced by transit with great community centers and fantastic parks. They could tell you about how, you know, the distance between waste bins on the street is too far apart. And all of these things are planning issues. And similarly, all these things are political issues as well. And that dialogue, hearing where people are coming from, having the empathy in your leadership to understand what the concern is, not just shut them down, not preach from a position of self-righteousness or moral authority, but like, okay, like what are you concerned about? Is it your property value? And like asking them if you're concerned about property value, not from a like, oh, you're terrible because your biggest investment or nest egg that your whole retirement plan is based around, you feel like that's in jeopardy. And I'm not criticizing you for that. I'm understanding. Okay, well, like let's look at some of the data. Typically, when somebody invests $100 million in a new project and there's new park space and public realm and stuff, like typically, we actually don't see property values going down. In fact, we see the opposite. Property values end up going up. But just understanding from a place of empathy in your leadership where people are coming from, not a place of criticism, not acrimonious and combative, but like, look, I get that this is difficult and this isn't the Toronto that you grew up in, but it is going to change and you can be a constructive and positive part of that change. Let's talk about it.
Yeah, I think it's got to go both ways though too. Like the challenge with politics is that, you know, the political career is a tough one, right? Where in today's society, you don't really have a lot of room to go out and try things, right? Hey, we have a plan, we think it's going to work, and this is what we want to do, but it's going to take a few years to implement, and we're going to have to see how it's going to work out, and then maybe we make some changes, right? I have to put something into motion now that's going to, or at least this is my, I guess, perception of the mindset is we have to make a policy change that's going to be, you know, accepted by the largest majority of people because we want to keep, you know, the votes, we want to keep a certain amount of people happy, whatever side of the platform you may be sitting on. But as like, you know, a citizen, you have to be able to give room for politicians to come in, make suggestions, maybe be wrong or maybe be slightly off, come back and make a correction and not be, oh, well, you know, Brad said he was going to increase housing by however many units this year. His plan didn't work. Like, we're not voting him in again next year. Like, there has to be room to be able to have some trial and error and a little bit of forgiveness. And I feel like the way politics has like evolved, there is no room for that. Like, there is no room for trial and error, changing some things, tweaking it, because, you know, the career is so just relying on votes.
Precarious.
Yeah, like it's an interesting situation.
I would challenge that a little bit and say, I think there's more room there than we think, and that's on the politicians. Trust in public elected office is at an all-time low. Trying to think of which polling company just came out with this survey or something a month ago and said like local government trust has never been lower in elected officials. So you could say, oh, like these guys are all terrible, you know, they're liars, whatever. Or you could ask the question, why? Why do people feel that way? And I think to your point, you can have more credibility if you say, look, Ehren, like this is the direction I think we need to go. This is the calculation on how I think that's going to work. We're going to monitor this. We're going to take the feedback, and we're going to review it in a year. We'll see where we're at. Something like that. And that's what you would do in a business setting as well, with a new product launch, a new idea, whatever. You set up the metrics, you figure out how you're going to be accountable to it, and then you evaluate. I think the problem with politicians is they're so reluctant to acknowledge or admit or indicate when they got it wrong, that the tendency for some people is to actually gaslight the residents and say, oh, no, like this bike lane isn't the problem. You're the problem because you don't ride a bike. People are like, what are you talking about?
Yeah.
You know, this section of Bloor West has 35,000 vehicles on it a day. It has 17 bicycles. 50% of the road capacity has been allocated to 0.0001 of the road users. What do you mean? I'm not crazy. This is the data. Like, no, that's not the data. No, there's not any problems with emergency vehicles. Everything's fine. Nothing to see here. And people are like, what world are you living in? And so I think we could have better discussions if, you know, folks who are elected officials or in leadership positions were more honest about when they've tried things and the things haven't worked. And I think you could build that trust with people if you could point to a couple things and say, yeah, like that didn't go the way we thought it was going to go, but here are the things that we're doing to fix it or to change course or to make some improvements, rather than just doubling down on a bad take, which I think is the knee-jerk reaction for a lot of elected officials. And I think that is why, you know, people write it off as like, oh, these guys are full of it, or they're just going to talk out of both sides of their mouth, or they're a bunch of liars.
I think you still have the space for it. Like, people still have to be receptive to, you know, you coming out and, or any politician coming out and saying, hey, like, didn't quite work as what we thought, but we've assessed, and here's the changes we're going to make. I think,
or they call you a flip-flopper. And
well, that's the problem, and that's my point, right? Is that you have to be able to, like, politicians are acting this way for a reason, and it's because of, you know, how the system works, right? Like, if the people don't give you any space to come out and make changes and not call you a flip-flopper, it's always going to be that way, right? People are always going to be concrete in one mindset and not change.
And you know what? Sometimes new information presents itself, the context changes, the world changes, and people's views evolve. And we should all have sort of the grace for everybody to allow for that space. Politicians get less of that. I think they get less of that because they also lack the humility to sort of, you know, honestly acknowledge when things need to change or they've gotten it wrong. But as a society, I think if we provided a little bit more space, a little bit more grace, you could have more productive conversations, because you can point to a myriad of issues, even like contentious political issues that, you know, were sort of bellwethers for political ideology, you know, a woman's right to reproductive health, equality for LGBTQ. Like, there was a time in this country not that long ago where there was not universality, generally speaking, agreement on those things. But guess what? Society evolved, people's minds were opened, people learned, positions changed and evolved. Before our time, I'm probably older than you guys, but even before our time, right? But, you know, somebody today would have probably different views on that than they did 30 years ago.
Absolutely.
So, and that's okay. I actually think it's good and it's healthy. And we need to have those same types of conversations and create that space for each other, certainly when it comes to housing, certainly when it comes to the evolution of cities and the type of development and density and types of buildings we're going to see in neighborhoods going forward.
Absolutely.
I know we got 5 minutes, but I don't know if we want to give you maybe 5 minutes, because I think your name's a bit of a front runner for upcoming mayor 2026, just in terms of popularity, popular name. Do we want to give you a little bit just to touch on what your future vision kind of looks like, things that you would like to?
Well, look, you know, there's nothing official yet.
No,
the election is
sorry,
know,
not
still,
as a
still,
just
still,
the name in the running.
What I could tell you is there's a lot of frustration here in Toronto. People feel like local government is very out of touch with their day-to-day needs, and I think about it as a father. You know, it's never been more difficult to get around Toronto. Sometimes I drive a car, sometimes I ride a bike, sometimes I take transit, but, you know, it's a bumpy ride across all three of those. And, you know, moving people in this city, a city that's 640 square kilometers, has to be a priority. And when we continually tie up parallel street after parallel street after parallel street with construction and no coordination, that's frustrating. When the Utah Hockey Club is having to abandon ship and get off the bus and walk down to the Scotiabank place, that's embarrassing. You know, when you take the TTC Line 1 Young Line and it's constantly being throttled on the speed as it goes north because we're trying to preserve the longevity of the rail, that's embarrassing and it's very frustrating. And all of a sudden, the TTC is not the better way. It's the transit choice of last resort. So, like, quality of life issues, the ability to move around Toronto, to get to the job site, to get to the office, to get home to your family at the end of the day, super important. You know, we've had a rash of really destabilizing, violent crimes here in this city and others recently. That's not just local government's issue, but are we prioritizing and directing resources appropriately to deal with that? You know, I have not met a father in this city that doesn't keep a baseball bat in their bedroom because, you know, if somebody comes in there, the assumption is they're there to do harm. They're kicking in your front door, and it might be 15 to 20 minutes before the police arrive. So, like, you're going to do what you have to do to protect your family. So people are concerned about safety. And then affordability. You know, like, it's housing is the biggest bill that everybody pays every month. It's their mortgage or their rent. You know, housing starts have absolutely plummeted. We're on this fool's errand to try and, you know, become a developer as the city of Toronto, which is crazy. And then the biggest bill that you pay every year is your property tax bill. And your taxes have gone up by 25% over the past 3 years with the promises of better services that have failed to materialize. So there is a lot of frustration. And I think at the end of the day, local government needs to get back to basics. They need to focus on the core services. And that means that when it snows in the wintertime, we get the plows out, we actually clean up the snow. In the summertime, when it's hot out, the pools are open. You know, Toronto closed the pools this summer because it was too hot. And Miami didn't close down the pools. Scottsdale, Arizona didn't close down the pools. Our neighbors to the west in Mississauga and Pickering in the east, they didn't close down the pools. But we were not prepared for the heat wave that was in the forecast for an entire week. So, like, these are basic core competencies that have ceased to function. And I think if you look at the arc of Toronto, you know, over the past 10 years, we have seen a managed decline. And that is because the leadership here has tried to be all things to all people. Everybody's wanted to walk into the room and be the most popular person everywhere they sit down. But when everything's a priority, nothing's a priority. We've spread ourselves a mile wide and an inch deep, and it means that those core local government services, like I just described, you know, the city's doing about a C minus D plus level instead of having laser focus on what's most important and knocking it out of the park. And if we can do a better job on the basics, then we can be a city that's ready to build. Then we can be a city that is ready to unlock your potential, the best city in the world where you can raise a family or start a business or find access to opportunity. That's the vision that Toronto needs to achieve. We need to recognize, lean into our greatness, but we cannot do that unless we start to get the basics right. So I am seized with that every day. That's what I talk about. That's what I hear about from folks in Etobicoke, North York, Scarborough, and downtown. And I suspect that's a conversation we're going to keep having over the next 400 plus days.
I think the passion, you know, that you described in the what could be for such a great city, for one of the greatest cities in our country, you know, it needs somebody or people to stand up and do those things for it. It really does. And you know, Erin and I try our best to, you know, push our industry, and it looks as though you're doing your best to do best for your industry. And I'm really excited for, you know, obviously, everything you've already done, but what you're currently working on. It's a breath of fresh air to deal with somebody and to see somebody who's pushing the needle on making things a better place.
Well, thanks so much, and thanks for having me on today. Thanks for all the great work you do, and I'm sure we'll see you guys soon.
Yeah, thanks so much.
Cheers.